Welcome, friends, to this exciting new adventure in learning called The Miracle of America. I hope each one of you have one of our study guides, because in it you will find an outline of everything that I will be covering. And you will notice that each point has a blank, a word that has to be filled in. You actually have to help write the book. And that's done for a reason. Do you know that if you just sat and listened to the material that we'll be covering, you could only permanently recall, somewhere around 2% of it. But if you faithfully follow the outline and fill in the blanks, you'll be able to recall about 75%. That's the advantage of what we call programmed learning. Now, if you want to put down your pencil in case you're filling in the study guide, I'll just tell you a little story. I want to tell you about an individual who in 1966 came out of a penitentiary on parole from California. He'd been in there off and on for about 15 years, and while he was there, he'd been studying under a man named John Hall. John Hall was a communist. He carefully trained this young American in all the philosophy of Marxism. John Hall said the communists were right. Karl Marx was right. America should be burned down and destroyed, and we should start over with a whole new system. He was very critical of the Constitution. He was critical of our open society. He was critical of our whole American heritage. And as a result, this young American ex-convict came out on the streets in 1966, a dedicated communist and ready to burn the country down. His name was Eldridge Cleaver. Eldridge Cleaver joined one of the new revolutionary movements, which was called the Black Panthers. And from his point of view, they were a great success. Within 2 years, by 1968, they had over 100 American cities burning. However, Eldridge Cleaver was a black. It bothered him a little when the communist leaders kept having them burn down black communities and black neighborhoods. He didn't know it then, but he learned later that they were trying to intimidate the people so they would be under the discipline of the Black Panthers and the other groups that were controlled by the Communist Party. In any event, it was about that time that the shooting began, and there were quite a number of the leaders of the Black Panthers who were killed, and also a number of policemen were killed, and they were blowing up buildings and so forth, trying to get even with society. It was a very difficult period, and as a result, Eldridge Cleaver found himself in a shootout, and he didn't kill anybody, but he got wounded himself. And that's when he left the country. And he fled first to Cuba, and then to Algeria, and then he went to Red China, and he was in North Korea, and then he was in Russia. He went the whole Red Circuit. But he noticed something. Nowhere was communism a success. Everywhere there were lots of people who wanted to get out of the Iron Curtain and away from the bamboo curtain and get to America. And before long, Eldridge Cleaver was doing some hard thinking. He thought back on what John Hall had taught him. No God, no soul, no future life, and no America. It was a future without hope. And he decided he'd been wrong. He came back, he said to himself, the Black Panthers were wrong. Our whole approach was wrong. And so he went to the American embassy and asked if he could come back, go to prison, serve his time. He said, I'd rather be in jail in America than free in these countries. So he came home. He served his time. He finished his parole, and now he's free. And he teaches for us because he has a great story to tell. He really appreciates America now. But you know, when he first came to us, he had 3 important questions. And those questions are in your outline. And that's where we're going to start. And I hope you have your outline and your pencil as we go now through the subject matter that has been assigned to us. First of all, Eldridge Cleaver wanted to know what was the great success formula of the founders. And where did they get all their great ideas for? Now, under number 1, F1 is success. Where did the founders get that great success formula? And where did the founders get their great ideas from? Number 2, what was the American prosperity formula that made the United States the richest nation on earth? He wanted to know that too. And number 3, prosperity, of course, is your blank for number 2. Number 3, he wanted to know what happened in America to get us off the track, so he didn't follow those great success formulas in recent years. And track is your blank for number 3. You know, after Eldridge Cleaver had taken The Miracle of America, the very course that you're now going to be taking, here's what he said.
Recently, I took some classes from Dr. W. Cleon Skousen on The Miracle of America. I wish every family in the United States could hear this great message. If my family had enjoyed these classes when I was growing up, I would have never been a communist. I would have learned to love America because I would have known her great secret.
And now H, he later said, you know, we need to know more about what's happening to America to get her off the track so we can know what to do about it. And that's what this course is all about. All right, will you turn now to Roman numeral 2? The great American story and how it all began. You know, it's important to remember that it took the Founding Fathers 180 years to put their success formula together, from 1607 to 1787. They made a lot of mistakes, but they finally got it in place. And once it got to operating and people would see how successful it was, it became the hope of the world, and that's your blank under B. Under A, it's 180 years. Under B, hope of the world. Now, to give you an idea how influential it had become, in 1848, France had a tremendous revolution, overthrew their king, and then they wanted to know what to do. Well, there had been one very, very prominent Frenchman by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville had been in America and written books about it. And I've quoted here what he said to the people. He said, you know, for 60 years there has been the kind of a solution that we are looking for, where all the power has been in the hands of the people. And he says for 60 years the people, meaning of America, who have made it a common source of all their laws, that is to have power in the people, have increased continually in population, in territory, and in opulence. And then he said, consider it well, it is found to have been during that period not only the most prosperous, but the most stable of all the nations on earth. And that meant politically and economically. Now, by 1905, capital C, the United States had become the foremost industrial nation in the world. And you fill in industrial there in your blank. Well, of course, it was still a tiny nation. We weren't very many people. We only had 6%, and that's number one. 6% is your blank. Number two, we were producing over half of everything. Over half of all the food, all the clothes, cars, telephones. And number three, it was only as other nations followed that same formula that they were able to have similar success. Capital D, once the American success formula had been developed and put into operation, the biggest challenge was to perpetuate it from generation to generation. You know, once you get a good thing going, you want to keep it going. Now, how do we do that? Roman numeral 3, the founder said you do it by universal education, and that's your blank, education. Capital A, they knew that they had done a great thing in developing the first free people in modern times, and that's your blank, first. The first free people in modern times was the United States of America. And capital B, they knew that it could be lost in a single generation, and lost is your blank. It could be lost in a single generation if Americans didn't educate themselves from generation to generation. Now, number one, at that time, the idea of universal education was very unique. U-N-I-Q-U-E. It was really unique. And that's your blank. Other nations weren't advocating universal education. Number two, when John Adams visited France, he was shocked to learn that out of more than 24 million people, only 500,000 could read and write. Isn't that interesting? And that's your blank, 500,000. Capital C. You see, the founders rejected the European concept that only the upper elite class should be educated. And your blank is class. The Founding Fathers wanted everybody to have a good education. It took a while to get there, but they ultimately succeeded better than anywhere else in the world. Now, here's Thomas Jefferson saying that they were actually depending upon education to keep our nation going forward. Listen to him. No other sure foundation can be devised for the preservation of freedom and happiness. Preach a crusade against ignorance. And that's your blank. Ignorance. Established and improve the law for educating the common people. See, everybody. Let's get everybody educated. Capital D. They immediately put direct responsibility on the parents. And that's your blank. Parents. Put it on the parents to make sure those children get an education. Now, number one, in 1642, the Puritan Fathers passed a law, and that's your blank. They've actually passed a law requiring all parents to see to it that their children could read well enough to understand religious principles and the important laws. That's a very interesting thing. And now, two, by 1700, now you see that's 76 years before the Declaration of Independence. By 1700, the home training of children was so widespread that there were 130 editions of spelling books in just one city of Boston, and they had 332 different primary readers. I think that's more than we probably have today. That's how seriously they took this business of educating their children. Number three, I have a little quote here where it says, home education was so common in America that most children knew how to read before they reported for school. And that's your blank, before. And it's rather interesting that many of the children were reporting for school at around age 4. So they started in this reading business very, very early. Capital E, there were thousands of private schools springing up everywhere during the colonial period. And these have been called people's schools because parents and the people themselves were taking a direct responsibility to see that the children got good educations. Now, they were using not only the home, but all the available schools, the church, voluntary associations, circulating libraries, apprenticeships, and a lot of self-study, and that's your blank. A lot of self-study. I learned as a college teacher, a university professor, that my best students were those who had learned early in life to discipline themselves to self-study. Jefferson was like that. He would study from 12 to 15 hours per day. And he could be in a nice social setting, and he loved people, he loved sports and so forth. He would take himself away and say, I'm sorry, I got to get back to the books. And as a result, by the age of 24, he had about 4 languages that he was quite good in using. And when he passed the bar at Williamsburg, he knew more about the law than the people that tested him. It was interesting. That comes from self-study. Now, this type of approach to training of children remained the bulwark of American education until the present century. Gradually, public schools entered the picture. Now, this may surprise you, since they didn't develop until quite recently, but the Founding Fathers actually tried to get public schools going right from the very beginning. And so, number one, under F, as far back as 1647, the legislature of Massachusetts said that any town of 50 families has got to have a grammar school. And any town of 100 families has to have a secondary school to help young people be prepared for college training should they desire to go on. Number two, private schools were nevertheless used primarily to meet these provisions. In 1776, when our nation came into being, there was only one city in the United States that had a system of public schools, and that was Boston. Number three, as late as 1818, you see, after the country's been going for a while, an actual formal survey was conducted to see where the kids were. Where are all our children? Are they in school or aren't they in school? I want to know about that. Here's what it said. They studied children from 4 on up. And they found that 2,360 of them were in 8 public schools. But over 4,000 of them were in 150 private schools. And then there were 8 charity schools for the poor, which charged no fee. Attendance at all of the schools was voluntary. Now that's very interesting. Sometimes we wonder, would the parents have their children go to school if it was just voluntary, not compulsory? It was sort of interesting. All the children were in school except 10%, and many of them were only age 4, and parents didn't think they were ready yet. So even on a voluntary basis, the emphasis on education was so strong that practically everybody was in school who was old enough. All right, now number 4, even as late as 1860, just before the war between the states, there were only 300 public schools. but there were 6,000 private academies. So it was still just beginning to catch on. But number 5, it was gradually popularized, and it virtually exploded toward the latter part of the 1900s. And today, we have over 98,000 public schools in the United States, and we still have 23,000 private schools. But anyway, the object was universal education. Now, 2 unique features developed as the public schools developed. A, compulsory attendance was extended to 12 years in most states. Not quite so much in some states, but in most states it was compulsory for 12 years, and that's your blank under A. B, a tremendous amount of federal aid began to pour into the schools, so that today about $8 billion go to the public schools and about $6 billion to the private schools. Now, the private schools do not get very much money for the schools themselves. Most of that money is for exploratory, or rather research grants. Now, number 7, between both the private and the public devices, educational institutions, this whole concept of universal education was remarkably successful, and it reached out to practically all of our people, and even reached out among our minorities, especially the blacks. We finally got everybody in on it, and that's what the Founding Fathers originally intended. And today, we have something that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world so far as I know. A recent study showed that a black boy or girl in Mississippi has a better chance of going through the school system and getting into college than a white boy or girl in England. And that's your blank, England. Of course, the big question was, now that you've got schools spread out all over and you've got everybody involved, can you keep up the quality of education? Quality, and that's your blank. Now we have to ask ourselves a question. What is quality education? Now, education in America has gone through 2 cycles. And if you go to Roman numeral number 4 now, education in America had a first cycle, an early cycle, that lasted about 280 years, from 1607 to 1887. Education during that period had many of the same characteristics and qualities. Then it changed, and we'll discuss that in a moment as we went into the second cycle. But let's talk about the first cycle. The most remarkable thing about education in America is that right from the beginning, we had a very high level of educators available, and a requirement of excellence in education for anyone who did go to school, as nearly as they were able to under the circumstances. So during the colonial period, we had a very high level or high quality of education being advocated. Number 1, this partially resulted from the fact that by 1646, now notice how early that is, 1646, Boston is only about 16 years old at that time. We didn't have anything but villages in America, but we already had 130 graduates from Oxford, Cambridge, and Dublin universities over here teaching. And 2, the strict discipline in educational preparation for professional life is reflected in the kind of people that this sort of discipline produced, that is, these requirements of a very high-quality education produced. Take, for example, the description which John Adams gives of his son, John Quincy Adams, who was only 18. And he's writing a letter and describing how his son is coming along at age 18. He already is proficient in Latin, French, and Greek. He has also studied English and French literature, many of the Greek classics. He has studied Roman, English, and Greek history. He knows the theorems of Euclid and plane trigonometry, algebra, decimal fractions, geometrical proportions, and so forth. He was a little apologetic because his son was still a little weak in calculus. Well, assuming there was a little bit of bragging here by a father over his son, I think you'll be impressed as I am that that son had really been put through a rigorous discipline in education. Now, number 3, there was a remarkable dedication, a remarkable degree of dedication among the teachers. Now, being an educator myself, having spent many years in teaching at a university, I'm impressed with the quality of teachers and their dedication in trying to get the job done. But many of them have been very dissatisfied with the approaches that we've been making in the second cycle. You see, we're in the second cycle now. They'd like to do what some of the earlier teachers were able to do. And I want to tell you about one or two of these teachers. For example, number 3, we have a man by the name of Ezekiel Cheever, a graduate of Emmanuel College at Cambridge. He taught successively in New Haven, Ipswich, Charleston, and Boston. And he wrote several textbooks. And he died in the Hornets at the age of 92, and he'd never missed a day of school. Of course, the periods when they taught school was very often shorter than they are now. But nevertheless, isn't that a tremendous record? There was a dedicated teacher. Now, capital B. By 1836, sort of keep that date in mind. By 1836, right after we have Andy Jackson going out of office, we have the William Holmes McGuffey Readers coming out. Now, you may have heard of the McGuffey Readers. Many of us were trained on them. They became national bestsellers. Number 2, by 1920, there were over 120 million copies in print of the McGuffey Readers. Nearly every child had one or more copies of a McGuffey Reader to study out of. And of course, there were a total of 6 books for each of the various grades. Now, capital C, throughout the first cycle of American education, and particularly in readers like the McGuffey Readers, there was a strong emphasis on basics. Now, ordinarily we think of basics as reading, writing, and arithmetic. But as you will see, it's not just that. It's in about 12 different areas that they studied basics. Now, let's begin with reading. Number 1, McGuffey used 2 methods of teaching children to read. For example, in the single-syllable words like cat and dog, you'd memorize it with pictures. But if you had more than one syllable, he used a different method. That's B. Phonics were required. And phonics had the student memorize, and that's your blank. He had the student memorize the sound of various syllables. For example, T-I-O-N, you just had to know that that was pronounced shun, T-I-O-N, shun. And you would memorize it. He'd get all these syllables lined up for you so that you would be accustomed to learning how to pronounce them. And then it also involved memorizing, under C, that's your next blank, memorizing prefixes and suffixes and the correct pronunciation of diphthongs, such as OU in rough, and EI in 8, and EA in great. I mean, he had you memorize those so that you were sort of familiar with them and would know how to pronounce them when you ran across them. He also would have you memorize all of your double consonants, like GH in rough, and PH in phone, and SH in shenanigans. Anyway, you had to know those double consonants. Now, these phonics greatly facilitated both spelling and vocabulary building. And let me just give you an example. I think I was in the 4th grade when I ran across a 5-syllable word that just stopped me cold, and it was disproportionate. And I went up to the teacher and I said, I don't know what this word is. Well, she said, let's break it down into syllables. So I did dis, pro, por, shun, eight. She said, now do you recognize it? And I said, no, I don't recognize it. She said, look at it carefully. Do you recognize any part of it? Well, I said, I know what a portion is. All right. She said, have you ever heard of a proportion? And I said, yes, my mother's always talking about the right proportion in recipes. All right. She said, what does she mean? I said, I guess she means the right amount of things. She said, that's right. She said, now you've memorized what dis means, and disappointed and dissatisfied. What's dis mean? Well, I said, that means taken away from. All right. She said, then if you have a disproportion, what are you going to have? And I said, I guess you'd have the wrong amount. She said, you're right, disproportion. I said, then what's the 8 on the end for? Well, she said, is disproportion a noun, a verb, or an adjective? And I said, well, it's the name of something, so it must be a noun. And she said, then you want to talk about a disproportionate amount. That's not going to fit very well. You can't have a noun usually modifying another noun. So we got to change that disproportion into something that modifies amount. And so we need an adjective, don't we? And I said, that's right, that's right. So she said, we put ate on the end, that makes an adjective. We changed a noun into an adjective. Now you've got disproportionate. She said, now spell it for me. So I did. Now she said, you'll never forget that word. That's your word. And it really was. And that was most helpful in those early days, memorizing a few of those very basics and most important basics and putting them all together. All right, let's go to the next one, which is writing. 2 basics in writing. Now that involved extensive practice in penmanship, and that meant a proper way to hold a pencil between the index finger and the thumb, and with the third finger holding it in position. And we would practice. It was very important that you hold a pen exactly right. And you had to just barely have your arm on the table so that you could scroll, and your little finger barely touched. And you would find that you could get a lot of motion in your writing. And if you practiced enough, you got a real beautiful cursive writing. Now, script or cursive writing was used from the very first grade, and that's B. A was practice penmanship, and B is writing cursory script instead of printing. Now, we were taught to print, but we never used it. I mean, we knew how to print, but we use cursive writing because it's so much faster. If you try to write an A, you can do it with 2 strokes. On the second stroke, you're joining your next word. If you print that, it will take 3 different motions before you can go over to the next word. And so cursive writing is about 30% faster than printing is. Now, I've noticed students, when printing was made more popular, I noticed how they cramped up their fingers. Sometimes they would clutch the pencil instead of holding it as a penman is taught to hold it. Or they would hold it between their index finger and their third finger, and that facilitated printing, you see, because they're pressing down and printing. It's just a different approach. Now, 3 was basics in arithmetic. That usually referred to bookkeeping and business. It was always practical. They needed to know the basics in oral and written communication. Now, there was strong emphasis on vocabulary. You must know your words, and on spelling, which is your blank. Spelling, under A, 4A. And 4B, there was student competition in spelling bees, essay writing, declamation, oratorical contests, and that's your blank, contests. Lots of contests. Some people say, well, that makes some students feel bad because they don't do so well. That's the greatest motivation in the world. That's actually life. Learning to do well because you're not doing well enough. And students got used to that competition. It was fun, just like football. Somebody has to lose each time. That's why they go out and practice more all the time. That's the way you succeed in life. You compete with yourself, not just with another team. You say to yourself, I can do better. So we'd have these contests. Now, we've been sponsoring some oratorical contests. Just recently, we had 100 high schools participate in one. It was What's Great About America? And the winner was taken to Washington for a nice vacation. And those students learned a lot in that oratorical contest. Whether they won the contest or not, they did a lot of good for themselves. Now, 5, basics in literature, both classics and contemporary. You know, that was the great thing about the McGuffey readers. It would introduce you to all kinds of classics, and just little bits of them, just enough to whet your appetite, not enough to bore you to death. And you'd want to know the rest of the story, and sometimes the teacher would tell you the story, and then you just read a little bit of it, and you just sort of planted an appetite, a desire to know more about it. And we were taught a lot of good poetry. We had to memorize a little poem, almost one a week, and it gave you a taste for poetry. Now, as that disappeared from our schools, I noticed that first poetry lost rhyming, and then it lost rhythm, until it didn't even sound like poetry anymore. Now, the real skillful poetry has both, and it needs to be developed. Anyway, good literature is important. And 6, basics in music, with everyone participating in singing and playing an instrument. And basics in the art form, painting, drawing, sculpture work, and so forth. 8, basics in nature study, plants, animals, astronomy, get you really excited about all of those areas. And the interesting thing about it, during Cycle 1, everybody got this treatment. I mean, not someone who just happened to have an interest in those areas. Everybody went through it pretty much. And then number 9, basics in history, particularly American history and its constitutional form of government. Now, it's very important who teaches history. You not only have to have a lot of background, but you have to be a good storyteller, because that's history. If a teacher cannot make history come to life, it'll bore the students to death and they'll hate it. But if they can get the excitement and the conflict and the drama that was in real history, flesh and blood history, they'll love it, and they'll study history all the rest of their lives. And number 10, basics in geography and the world's natural resources, knowing something about the earth and where it is, so that they can read the paper with some insights and know something about the people and know what their interest and culture is all about. And 11, basics in hygiene, both physical and mental. Then 12, basics in civics and how the American system works. That was very important, as you'll see in just a moment. Well, you can see that basics covered a lot more than reading, writing, and arithmetic. It was a comprehensive study of how to build fine, responsible citizens. And capital D, there was a strong emphasis during the first cycle on spiritual values, together with the mandates of morality and the qualities needed to develop strong character. And that's your blank, strong character. And there was a constant emphasis. Don't be a weakling. Have a strong character. What does that mean? That means standing up for right. That means having courage. That means having a compassionate, sensitive nature. Now, I hear some people say, well, I don't believe in spiritual things. I'm a materialist myself. Well, I don't think they really know what they're talking about. The difference between human beings and the lower animals is the element of spiritual insight and qualities. For example, our ability to respect the property of others, that's a spiritual quality. That's not material. Are sensitive to somebody who's in need or somebody who needs help, that's all spiritual. Our appreciation that we live in an orderly universe that has been very carefully designed for us, and that it's a great privilege to be a participant in it, that's all spiritual. And the thing that tells you what's the difference between right and wrong, those are all spiritual qualities. We sometimes call them moral or ethical, but you'll notice they're not material. And when a person has a high level of, what should we say, a sensitivity to right and wrong, these are the people that have strong characters. Now, in the McGuffey readers, they had all kinds of these, a lot of stories and so forth. There was frequent reference to the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's good. Go out and work for your own. A lot of emphasis on the golden rule, to do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And then there were a lot of popular Bible stories. Well, that was all part of the first cycle. Now, number one, it used to be traditional to have a little ceremony at the beginning of each school day. And as a teacher, I have learned that a little ritual at the beginning of a class will settle them down faster than anything I know. It could be a very simple ritual. If it's even just singing a little song, it will help. But anyway, I remember when we always had a little prayer to begin with. We had the Pledge of Allegiance, and then we'd sing one verse of a song. And we all memorized the words for America the Beautiful, and the song America, and the Star-Spangled Banner, because we sang them all the time. And then, two, both teachers and the text were expected to drill into the students the necessity of being a responsible human being. And there was a constant emphasis on certain qualities of character, and I just want to spin down through them fast. First of all, to be trustworthy. That means honest in performing obligations and fulfilling promises. And then being loyal. And we were told to be loyal to God, to our family, and to our country. And that sounds just like the Founding Fathers. They said that same thing all the time. And then C, be helpful to old and young people alike, not just to your peers. Be helpful to people. And then D, be friendly. That's just a warm, friendly relations with everybody, a warm relationship with others. Be friendly to people. Don't be hostile. Don't be a wallflower. Go up and say hello to people. And then be courteous, and that just means being considerate and polite. And then be kind, especially to the unfortunate and the weak and the elderly. That was stressed all the time. McGuffey readers, they must have 50 stories in there about being kind to people or things in need. And then obedience to parents and teachers and those in authority. See, that doesn't, what should we say, it doesn't intimidate and subordinate a child who has learned to be respectful of those that the order of society requires us to follow and to responsibly obey. That isn't subservient to our personalities. I had some of my students that came from certain states that would always address their elders as sir, yes ma'am. And I would know that they probably came from Texas, Oklahoma. There are several states that emphasize that quality, respect for those that they were obeying and honoring. And it did a lot for them. It increased their prestige, just having that quality of respect for people. And then being cheerful, especially under circumstances that are unpleasant. And then being thrifty, to live within your means, have a savings account, take care of your things, and don't be wasteful. Well, I remember that. Don't waste it, don't waste it. There are people going hungry today, don't waste your food, etc., etc. Then we have J, be brave in the face of danger or pain. And then be clean, cleanliness, physically, mentally, and morally. Now, the next one is be thrifty. Be reverent. Be reverent toward God, toward his creations, and toward his commandments. Well, unless a person has respect for the great fundamental things of life, he's lost one of the major dimensions of happy living and happy adjustment to life. Well, that's the way they were taught in the first cycle. Now, you'll notice that all of those 12 things that I've just mentioned were incorporated in the 12 Scout Laws. 12 Scout Laws, to be all of those things. Now, capital E. This first cycle of education also laid great stress on the need to improve and to perpetuate the American economic and political system, and that's your blank, system. The founders, number one, the founders said this was the responsibility of those who followed after them. You see, they kept talking about their successors. They said, I think this will go and it will be a great success forever if our successors preserve and perpetuate these principles. And I've given you an exact quote there from the Federalist Papers, where James Madison said that it depended upon their successors to improve and perpetuate the system. And successors is your blank. And number two, when Judge Alexis de Tocqueville came over from France in 1831, he was so impressed by what he saw going on over here that he stayed almost 2 years, went home and wrote probably the finest analysis of the American ideology and culture that has ever been published, in my estimation. Came out in 2 volumes, and it's called Democracy in America, and your blank is Democracy in America. And he says, quote, it cannot be doubted that in the United States the instruction of the people powerfully contributes to the support of the Democratic Republic. In other words, it's their schools, really, that carries these ideas on from generation to generation. And he said, this will always, and that's your blank, this will always be the case where the instruction which enlightens the understanding is not separated from moral education. In other words, we were not to just learn the nuts and bolts about how our system works, but the great underlying values, the great moral principles that underlie our system of life. And now, number 3, de Tocqueville recognized the importance of this moral foundation, which Americans attributed to their success formula. And then he described what it's like to talk to an American. Here's a Frenchman, you see, talking to Americans. If you question him respecting his own country, he will inform you what his rights are and by what means he exercises them. You will find that he is familiar with the mechanism of the laws. The American learns to know the laws by participating in the act of legislation. The great work of society is ever going on before his eyes and, as it were, under his hands. Now notice this. In the United States, politics are the end and aim of education. Now, politics means good government. And the purpose of the schools was to see that we were raising good citizens who knew how to participate in the democratic process. All right, number 4, de Tocqueville was particularly astonished by the knowledge which children had. He would talk about the Constitution with little children on the streets of Boston. And to his amazement, they could answer his question almost like they were a constitutional lawyer. And do you know why? They were all studying a little book called The Catechism on the Constitution. Now, a catechism is where you ask questions, and then it gives you the answer. And you go over them enough times so that you know those answers. And pretty soon that adds to your cultural background. And those children had really been learning their Constitution, he says. All right, Roman numeral 5. We finally went out of the first cycle and phased into the second cycle. And that's your blank. Second cycle of education began. Now, it just barely got started at the latter part of the 1900s. It was around 1887 that you can sort of pinpoint the beginning of this new cycle. And so capital A is 1887. Now, this was called a new experimental or exploratory era. And now that should have improved everything. But lo and behold, something happened. They started experimenting and exploring the very things the Founding Fathers had already, shall we say, experienced or tried out, and had rejected them because they were not sound, and that's your blank. They started trying to use the very things the Founders said, we tried, they didn't work, don't try them again. There were 4 groups, actually, that's capital C. There were 4 powerful groups that sort of coalesced, sort of rallied together, that really brought about the big change. And everybody ought to know about these groups because they gained power and are still in power to quite a large extent. Number 1, there was the populist movement, which demanded that the federal government use income taxes, that's your blank, income taxes, to confiscate some of the property of the rich and redistribute it among the lower economic classes. Now, the Founding Fathers wanted everybody to be just as prosperous as possible, but they said you must never do it at the expense of somebody else. You must have equal rights to your property, and there must not be any confiscation by government to spread money around because the politicians end up using it to buy votes. But anyway, that group demanded that the government get that power and start using it, the very thing the Founders had warned against. Number 2, there was a very wealthy industrial group, and they wanted the central government to have a lot of power. And their thought was that they would use their money and influence to kind of control the government and give them a lot of special favors. It's to sort of cut down competition. that was their objective. And that's the way it worked out, actually. They began to set up cartels after they got a strong central government. Now, your blank under number 2 is competition. And those very super wealthy people wanted the central government to get more power, cut down competition. Number 3, there was a third group of economists and political leaders who were intrigued by the theories of socialism. Now, some Americans know what socialism is, but we don't discuss it very often. There are a lot of things that we're doing today in our country which are according to socialist theory. Socialism is government ownership or control of the means of production and distribution. And there were some that felt that would be much better for America than the open free market society the Founders had set up. Then there was a 4th group of leading intellectuals which rejected the spiritual and moral foundation of the American formula and wanted it eliminated from education. This 4th group did not agree with George Washington. George Washington said that unless you teach moral principles to our people and make that an important part of the curriculum of the school, our system will not survive. That's the fundamental responsibility of parents and teachers and everybody to emphasize continually. But this 4th group wanted to get these out of the educational system because they didn't believe them. That's why they wanted them rejected. And so that's your blank under 4, rejected. Now, capital D, as we shall see later, the Founding Fathers counted all of the objectives of those 4 groups failure formulas, and that's your blank. Failure formulas. They said if you want to destroy our country, that's the way to do it. And here these people sort of grouped together, and by 1913 they had come into power, and they really never have been rooted out of power since. They've had a very large influence in the United States and the policies it's followed to a large extent ever since. Capital D, or capital E now, we're up to capital E. Nevertheless, the experimental tinkering with the Founders' success formula began to reflect itself in nearly every aspect of the American culture. Over a period of time, the standard, and that's your blank, the standard of values which were basic in the first cycle of education became seriously eroded. Now, as I've gone back and studied it, it's been very interesting to see what the second cycle did. Some educators have called it a cannibalistic approach, not an experimental approach, but actually devouring and destroying, talking against the most basic things in the first cycle that made it a success, actually opposing it and fighting it. And the educational discipline, for example, emphasized in the McGuffey readers, began to be phased out in favor of more loosely structured requirements in the classroom and in study and homework. And fortunately, we've had a lot of teachers that have tried to overlook what was popular and try to keep to those old standards. But in too many instances, they did begin to decay. And so we began to see a negative impact on the quality of education, and that's your blank, quality. Now, the erosion in the quality of education began to show up in reading and spelling, in writing and penmanship, in mathematics and scientific studies, in history and the roots of the American ideology, in geography and natural resources, in civics and political participation. My goodness, we can hardly get half the people to vote in a presidential election today. And in local elections, we're lucky if we get 15 to 25% of the people to participate. And probably that's because we have not emphasized it as much in our schools anymore. Literature, both classic and contemporary, also began to be abandoned, and communications in oral and written form eroded. Well, capital G, by 1983, a great many educators knew that this second cycle was not a success. There were some very serious things wrong with it, and they insisted that we sit down and do something about it. 5 different independent groups made studies, and all of them agreed that it was time for us to return to basics, and that's your blank. Now, a report from the National Commission on Excellence in Education said this, quote, "The educational foundation of our society are presently being eroded by a rising tide of mediocrity that threatens our very future as a nation and a people," unquote. Now, capital H, the findings of the Commission, which corresponded with all the other 4 studies, pointed out that there were some very dangerous signals appearing. And danger signals is what I should say, and danger is your blank, danger. For example, number 1, some 23 million American adults are functionally illiterate by the simplest tests of everyday reading, writing, and comprehension. And that's a quote. Well, what does that mean? What is it to be functionally illiterate? It means that a person is not able to read enough to read a recipe, to read a driver's manual of instructions, or to comprehend just the most ordinary instructions that might be handed to a person. And they found out that about 13% of all the 17-year-olds in the United States today must be considered functionally illiterate. In fact, it said, quote, "Average achievement of high school students on most standardized tests is now lower than when Sputnik was launched in 1957. Well, do you know that in 1957, when Sputnik went into space, they began pouring all kinds of money into the schools because they said, we've got to catch up with the Soviet Union. But now, you see, we didn't get to... our technology is still ahead of the Soviet Union, but when you talk about our overall standardized tests of our students, it's lower than it was back then. Number 4, between 1975 and 1980, remedial mathematics courses in public 4-year colleges increased by 72% and now constitute 1/4 of all mathematics courses taught in those institutions. Well, let me mention what that probably is describing. It means that students come in for engineering. They come in for mathematical courses of any kind, and they don't know their math. They have not been taught the basics, and they're incompetent. And so the university has to start all over and give them what we call a remedial course so that they can go on in chemistry or physics, and many areas that you just cannot go on if you do not have your mathematics. Now, there was a great complaint came from the military and also from businesses. They said these young people are being given graduating certificates and they can't read, they cannot spell, they don't know their basics, and there was a lot of complaining there. Paul Copperman made a statement that should really shock those of us who are in education. He said, each generation of Americans has outstripped its parents in education, in literacy, and in economic attainment. For the first time in the history of our country, in this generation, the educational skills of one generation will not surpass, will not equal, and that's your blank, will not even equal, will not even approach those of their parents. No wonder that we're getting ready to do something about it. And number 7, it was found that dropouts from the educational system between the 9th and 12th grades are running from 20 to 45%. And the problem is the ones that are dropping out are the least competent to enter the workforce and earn a living in many cases. And now during the second cycle, there was a serious decline in the moral and social quality of the American culture. Number 1, a tremendous increase in crime, and that's your blank, particularly in crimes of violence. Number 2, the annual cost of white-collar crime. Now, see, those are people that are educated, supposed to be responsible. They're professional people. Their crimes skyrocketed. No moral sense. They'll embezzle. They'll change the books. They'll steal from the till. That's white-collar crime. They'll take things out of the back room, television sets, typewriters, etc., and they're employees of the company. And number 3, for the first time in history, more than 1 million families were broken up by divorce each year. Divorce is your blank. And number 4, government reports indicated that for the first time, there were more babies in gestation destroyed by abortion than those that were born alive. And alive is your blank. More abortions than live births. And 5, promiscuous sexuality. You see, the moral code is breaking down. Promiscuous sexuality, just casual sexuality among teenagers and even among children created a whole new syndrome of unwed mothers, illegitimate children, and aggravated social destabilization which results from these problems because there's an irresponsibility there that had been encouraged. Where Cycle 1 emphasized constantly the necessity of being circumspect in this regard and being responsible about sexuality. And then sexual depravity in some of its most bizarre forms began to be widespread. It's practically become a wave. And there was some of it during Cycle 1, but now it's become practically an institution in our society. 7th, the filthy speech movement was promoted in the name of free speech. Soon 4-letter words had become a prominent part of the routine conversation of many people. And number 8, the First Amendment was used as an excuse to promote the public sale, distribution, and broadcasting of pornography nationwide. That's salacious literature, it's provocative, it's ugly, it stimulates particularly the minds of those that are highly suggestive, that are likely to commit sexual crimes. And pornography has been responsible for an atrocious increase in sex crimes. In fact, pornography has become a legalized industry because of some of the holdings of the Supreme Court. Well, number 9, addictive and sometimes brain-damaging drugs became a plague on the nation, and schools became infested with drug pushers, and some adults, even from the most sophisticated circles, were taking frequent trips and attending drug parties. And now capital J. There was a strong drive during the second cycle of education to completely secularize all phases of public education. For example, number 1, the United States Supreme Court eliminated prayer and Bible reading from the public schools for reasons that would have been completely incomprehensible to the Founding Fathers. Number 2, the teaching of spiritual values, which simply means the difference between right and wrong and those higher qualities of life, were no longer considered to be the responsibility of the schools. Now that's the blank is schools. Now this was contrary to the expressed policies of the founders in the Northwest Ordinance, which they passed in 1787, the same year the Constitution was passed. They said it is the responsibility of the schools to see that the students have a clear understanding of these great moral values that make for happy living in a happy society. And then number 3, the stories with moral lessons, which were so popular in the McGuffey readers and elsewhere. They always had a, well, we call it a moral. When you got through, you say, boy, that's impressive. I want to keep that in mind. I want to keep that little story in mind for the future. It'll guide my life. Those used to be in the McGuffey readers, and they began to be dropped from all of the books, almost as though it were being deliberately done, as though they didn't want it there anymore. For example, a recent study of texts from 1810 to 1950 reveals some interesting facts. Out of each 25 pages, they found that in 1810, 16 of them were about moral principles or something. You were learning a lesson all the time of what's better and what's best and so forth. 16 pages out of 25 were devoted to that. And then by, let's see, we get down to 1870, it was dropping off. There are only 6 pages now. We get down to 1930, it's only 1 page, 1 out of 25. And the present time, it almost has completely disappeared. Almost completely. Capital K. The second cycle was also characterized by much less emphasis on patriotism or any firm commitment to the basic principles of the Constitution. And basic is your blank. Number 1, the Constitution began to be called obsolete, and I remember that. As I came up through the schools in California, they very often said the Constitution doesn't apply to modern life. Well, the Constitution was designed to protect individual freedom. What's obsolete about that? It will never be obsolete. But anyway, they began saying that it was. And number 2, strange thing began to happen in the texts and the books. Some of the popular bestsellers that came out made very serious charges against the founders, especially against Franklin and against Jefferson and against Washington. And interestingly enough, they have now been proved to be myths. Somebody began to sit down and gather up all kinds of irresponsible documentation and charges against these men, which was disproven even in their own day. And they began to put it into books as though it could be believed. So your blank there is charges. And the Freeman Institute has now put out the real Thomas Jefferson and the real Benjamin Franklin, and we're about to come out with the real George Washington, in which we address some of those problems. It's all carefully documented. And it might just upset you a little bit, as it does me, that somebody would sit down and make up myths about these men which are discrediting to them and sort of overshadow any greatness that they did, and they were great. Well, number 3, the power base of government was shifted from strong local government to a powerful central government. Now, the whole Constitution was structured to prevent this from happening, and that's your blank. So it all had to be done in violation of the Constitution unless it were amended, which it was not. It was usually done by usurpation or by a judicial decree of the Supreme Court. And then 4, there was a shift from a free market economy to a highly regulated economy, and that's your blank, regulated. This also violated the Constitution. All right, now, we don't have much left, just a little bit here. Number 5, the nation went from very low taxes to extremely high taxes, and I don't have to comment on that. And number 6, here's an important one. The Monroe Doctrine was virtually abandoned. Now, in the Monroe Doctrine, it said that we would not only protect the Western Hemisphere from invasion, but that we would not meddle in the domestic affairs of other nations. Well, during the second cycle, we began intermeddling in the affairs of nearly every nation on the face of the earth. And we got ourselves all involved in entangling alliances and so forth, and I'm sure it was with the best of intentions, and that's your blank, best. And the American people have put out hundreds of billions of dollars to try and make it work in all this meddling. And it's been counterproductive. Very disappointing. The Founding Fathers were right. And number 7, the United States went from virtually no national debt, and debt is your blank, no national debt, to the biggest national debt in history. Do you know that the United States owes more money today than all the nations of this earth combined? That's how big our debt is. And it takes us $100 billion a year just to service that debt. Think how much good we could do with that $100 billion if we had it. If we didn't have a debt, we'd have that extra $100 billion. And then 8, American soldiers were ordered to fight abroad in undeclared wars. Now, we've done that several times. We did it in Korea, we did it in Vietnam, we're doing it now in other places. This is absolutely prohibited by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Our young men are not required under the Constitution to fight anywhere unless there is a declared war by Congress. So that's something we need to address. We need to look at. This second cycle got us into all kinds of problems. And number 9, the Supreme Court began issuing mandates and decrees which unlawfully amended the Constitution. Just amazing. The Butler case, 1936, and so forth. Just reversed what the Constitution had intended and did it without an amendment. And number 10, executive branch began issuing thousands of executive orders. Now, those are orders which are put out by the executive branch, and they become law, and they're enforceable in the courts. And today, the executive branch puts out more of those laws than the Congress does. And that's all in violation of the Constitution. All the lawmaking power in the Constitution is in the Congress. And as citizens, we were supposed to be protected from any law that had not been carefully scrutinized by our elected representatives. Number 11, the nation was taken off the gold and silver standard. Standard is your blank. Without a constitutional amendment. And number 12, for the first time, the Monroe Doctrine became the official, or for the first time since the Monroe Doctrine became our official policy. A foreign nation was allowed to get a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, supported by strong military bases in the Caribbean and Central America. The Soviet Union is so strong in Cuba and Nicaragua and trying to get elsewhere as part of her announced policy that she will first surround the United States and then choke her off until she falls from the tree like a piece of overripe fruit. Now, that's always been her policy, and we've sort of stood by, not enforced the Monroe Doctrine as she took over first Cuba, and she's very strong in the Panama, and she's practically taken over Nicaragua. Capital L. With all of these negative experiences emerging from the experiments and adventures of the second cycle, it was inevitable that the vast majority of the American people would begin calling for a substantive reform. And that's where we are now. We are just concluding the second cycle, and we're moving into the third cycle, and that's Roman numeral 6. We're moving into the third cycle. Third cycle. Well, this is kind of exciting, and it brings us to the conclusion of our discussion. Capital A. Perhaps the greatest value of the second cycle was that it taught us from bitter experience to better appreciate the Founding Fathers' success formula. And that's your blank. Better appreciate the Founding Fathers' success formula. Now, in a recent book called Back to Basics, Burton Yale Pines expressed the yearning of the vast majority of Americans to get our great country back on the track. And that's your blank. Get us back on the track. Capital C, based on the lessons learned from our study of the first cycle, the demand for a return to basics is simply a call for reform. In other words, we had it going once, and we had it going very well. We know what to do. Let's return to fundamentals. Well, what kind of a reformation are we talking about? Number 1, people want us to return to our original constitutional structure, which the founders said was the key, and that's your blank. It was the key to the American success formula. Number 2, people want a revival of quality education recommended by the National Commission. And good educators are asking for the same. They're anxious to get this thing back in focus again. Number 3, a return to free market economics with less intervention by government. And if they do that, there'll be millions of new jobs created. One of the great and most repressive things about the overregulation of government is that it keeps new companies from coming up and starting new organizational structures that will create lots of new jobs. Number 4, a restoration of moral and spiritual values in both public and private life. Now that hits each one of us. We've all got to look at our lives and see if we're really the quality of people that we would like to be. And 5, a reduction in taxes, federal, state, and local. Boy, I don't need to comment on that. Number 6, paying off the national debt. Let's get rid of that, and the billion-dollar interest that we have to pay each year to service it. And then let's restore sound constitutional money. You know, I'm old enough to remember when they took us off of our constitutional money system and said it wouldn't inflate, we wouldn't have to worry, we wouldn't have any more depressions, everything would be beautiful. Well, it isn't beautiful. And they manipulate our money up and down in a boom and bust cycle continually. 8, develop a sound system of privately owned Social Security. Do you know that if you had your own Social Security fund and paid in it from the time you start working in the 20s until 65, you would retire with several times more than the government would ever be able to pay you? We need to take a good hard look at that right away, because our present system of Social Security is almost defunct. It's almost bankrupt. And we got to change over to the other kind without hurting the people that are presently receiving Social Security, and that can be done. Number 9, turning public welfare programs into workfare, education, and job-creating opportunities instead of allowing millions of Americans to become permanently trapped on the poverty level. Do you know that our present public welfare program tends to make clients out of welfare people? So they stay on it from generation to generation, 3 and 4 generations still on welfare. Something wrong with that. During the first cycle, they tried to help you out while you were having a tough break, but they didn't keep you there. They tried to get you back into the system. And then finally, Roman numeral 7. Our objectives in studying the miracle of America are closely related to this latest trend, which is producing a third cycle. You will find that the teachings of the Founding Fathers conform to this new desire to restore some very fundamental principles in our national lifestyle. Capital A. In this course, we're going to get better acquainted with the genius of those who established the first free people in modern times. You're going to find it interesting to get more closely attached to the founders, their thinking, their experiences, and what they said. And we need to know the source of their great ideas. You ask many people about Polybius and John Locke and Montesquieu and so forth. They look at you and wonder, is that a songwriter, or what are you talking about? Well, these were great men. And the Founding Fathers studied them, and that's where they got a lot of their great ideas. And that's your blank. Capital C, we need to gain a renewed confidence in the practical application of their ideas to modern problems. No use studying history if it's just to pass away the time. But you'll find that the lessons of history will teach us what we should be doing now about many of our problems. And capital D, we need to begin to elect constitutionally trained officials at all levels of government. Now, you can talk to any congressman. There won't be very many that are really acquainted with the Constitution, at least the Founding Fathers' desires concerning it. They may know their Supreme Court cases, but even lawyers are very often unfamiliar with the real merits of the Constitution in the tradition of the Founding Fathers. Capital E, we need to know how important it is to become personally informed and involved in the American political system. Informed is your blank. And it begins with a course like this on the miracle of America. Capital F, we need to appreciate the great future which the United States can enjoy if we return to the basic principles of the original American success formula. I sure appreciate your being with me during this period, and now we're going to get ready for our next discussion, and that is going to be on the Founding Fathers' search for the most ideal society. I think you're going to find that exciting. Thank you.